I'm delighted and welcome back, Dosha Dobbs, who was here, I don't know.
Oh, it must have been like 6 years ago or
6 years
something.
ago with Red Carpet, when
Yeah.
they reported on the unusual. Were they technically fossilized conifers or just preserved
Just preserved. Yeah.
conifers?
Because they were not hard like
Right,
rubble.
they weren't but they were in mud, preserved very nicely. And at that time, they did a presentation on their findings. And Dosha has since graduated with distinction and gotten her master's. And your bachelor's is in anthropology with an emphasis on ethnobotany, as I
Yeah.
remember. And then she went on to the Cultural Resources Management Program at Sonoma State and received her master's and her thesis. It's a really fascinating subject. If anybody has been looking on the web at archaeology sites, you'll notice that there's a lot of work being done in Europe about starch residues on milling stones in terms of looking at what people were really preparing, gathering, preparing, and eating during the Neolithic. So what Dosh has been doing, and ahead of the game, in fact, is a similar kind of thing with milling stones, bedrock mortars, portable mortars too.
No,
Primarily
just,
bedrock.
yeah, primarily just bedrock for me.
And she'll tell you what bedrock mortars is. It's usually a big outcrop of rock, granite, basalt. It has the mortars ground into them. And there's spots in Sonoma County and Marin County. And then there's Chauncey, Grinding Rock State Park, if you don't get up there. But it's a fascinating subject. So without further ado, she's also the mother of 2 kids and works for Sonoma State as the
Repatriation coordinator.
and cultural liaison.
Yeah.
So the repatriation has to do with archaeological collection
Mhm.
and bringing back to the original people. So not only do you do interesting research, but you have a fascinating job. So without further ado, your ability. Use this or
I think we're gonna see, right?
It should work.
Does this work?
Yeah.
Okay. What about you folks online? Is this okay? Fantastic. So, not for me. Maybe, let's try that one more time. Let's see if I can see. Oh yeah, no, I'm fine.
Nice.
That's not better for you guys to view? Okay, perfect. Yeah, as Virginia mentioned, my name's Dosha Dodd. I kind of got my start with ethnobotany herbalism from my dad. I grew up on plant-based medicine and, I still make it today. And so I tried really hard to become a scientist, right? Like I was like, I want to do science. But at the same time, I really wanted to like focus on plants and how humans, that relationship between humans and plants. And I kind of found my interesting path to starch grain residue analysis. I knew someone that was working on it, and I thought that was cool. Like this might be my little niche, and this is what came from that. So thank you all for being here. So today I'll be discussing starch grain residue analysis data collected from bedrock milling features, also known as BRMs, which are intentionally made bowls used to process plant-based material. And I also want to kind of talk about this in a new manner to discuss a Taskscape. And I will explain what that is later. There we go. Okay. So during this presentation, I will describe, my thesis statement, provide a brief summary of starch grain research, the cultural and environmental settings of the ranch, which was my project area, the methods used to answer my research questions. I'll sum up the starch grain results, and I'll describe the schematic designs that I used to illustrate the BRM Taskscape. Lastly, I'll be discussing my conclusion and areas of future research if anyone wants to take this further. Okay. The goal of this research was to investigate how the Nisenan engaged with their environment at two contrasting habitation sites by creating and maintaining their social landscapes through their subsistence settlement systems. The two main sites analyzed in this research are outlined here in blue on this map. That shows pretty well, I think. And then I also looked at the outlier sites, which are smaller sites that were not considered habitation sites because they contained 2 or less BRMs along with no other artifacts. And can't quite see it, but they're outlined in the green. Yeah.
Where is this map?
So this is in Yuba County. It's a 5,000 acre ranch that's privately owned currently. Yeah.
You might want to tell people who the Nisenan are. No.
I will get there, I promise.
Sorry.
This is the road
Sorry,
map.
sorry.
I know. A lot of things to say. I will get there, I promise, and we'll talk about the this ranch as well. But yeah, like moving on to my research questions. So what plant-based material is being processed at each site? And how do the two sites differ from each other in function and seasonality of use? And how can this data substantiate the concept of a taskscape at the ranch? Right, so you're like, taskscape, what is that? You know? So a taskscape is the habitual daily activities and the locations of those tasks completed by active agents in their environment. So thinking about humans as active agents and not passive agents. So, you know, they did all these things intentionally and with purpose, and more times than not, communally. So the goal of my research was to go beyond identifying what the Nisenans processed in the bedrock mortars in the past, and to start to think about the individuals who have utilized the BRMs, which were most likely women, as active agents in their environment. Using the concept of a taskscape as a tool to extrapolate the data derived from starch grain residue analysis, archaeobotanists can discuss a subsistence settlement system in a different manner. In order to obtain and process material in a BRM, several tasks must first need to take place. The taxa identified and the habitats they grow in are used to infer different strands of the BRM taskscape. So these can include the knowledge of when different taxa are available to harvest, what ecosystems need to be traveled to in order to gather that taxa, and lastly, the social organization to manage a group of individuals conducting different tasks. Woven within all of that is the social aspect of community, that feeling of belonging, and the camaraderie and everyone working together to maintain their familial subsistence settlement systems. It also brings into account a social aspect of community and can be used to discuss the Nisenans' relationship with their environment. A social landscape is an area of land that through repetitive use had social meaning to a group of people. Starch grain data allows for the identification of different habitats where tasks take place by individuals and will be used to discuss the BRM taskscape schemata. So you're like, okay, you're talking about taskscapes, you're talking about starch grains. How does this relate to plants? You're like, when are we going to get to the cool plant stuff? So what are starch grains? Starch granules are semi-crystalline structures stored within all plants and are only visible through a microscope. So if you see this diagram to the right, showing where starch can be stored within a plant. Starch can be found in the fruit, the green fleshy parts, and the underground storage organs. Louderback et al. 2016 created a morphological and morphometric approach to identifying starch grains. This picture in the bottom left-hand corner shows examples of starch grain features, including on the bottom, the difference between acentric and eccentric hilum, lamellae, also known as growth rings, and fissures known as cracks. The morphology of a grain is different based on the different taxa. Hart 2011's article proved that it was successful to recover starch grains from artifacts retrieved from archaeological surveys. Prior to this, most starch grain research was conducted on artifacts recovered from excavations. This is prevalent because BRMs are immovable objects found on survey. And Hart 2011 proved that such artifacts are admissible to this method. Next, I'll provide a few examples of how starch grain research in the Western United States has been used in the anthropological discipline. Herzog and Lalor 2016 tested the relationship between baskets and BRMs with dietary expansion trends in the early Holocene of Utah. The starch grain results were supported by the optimal foraging models that predicted which resources should be expected in early Holocene diets. If the presence of these two tools are indicators of dietary expansion. In the end, the authors argued that the association of a coiled basket and milling tools with dietary broadening of small grass seeds intensification may be inaccurate. So you're like, what does that mean? Right? You're like, those are a lot of words. If you were to find baskets and milling stations, you would assume that you would be able to find small grass seeds, but not in the case in Utah. So root crops, macro remains, are not commonly found in the archaeological record, despite their prevalence of ethnographic importance. So a lot of people were eating, you know, what some people would call like an Indian potato or like the carrot, things like that, but they're not found in the archaeological record. Pierce and Schultz 2016 provided the first evidence of the blue dick root crop used in the Owens Valley of California by conducting starch grain research on milling stones. So if you can see here at the bottom, there's a picture of the blue dick wildflower and its corresponding starch grain with that very diagnostic eccentric hilum. Wisely 2016 investigated BRM depth and function in the eastern Sierra Nevadas. His results supported the concept that many plant resources were processed in bedrock mortars and not just acorns like many people talk about. Additionally, the findings correlate with a wider diet breadth, particularly of small seeds, rather than the increased subsistence of acorn as a dominant food source. So what I can say is that since I finished my thesis and have worked on a few other projects, like in the Sierra Nevadas, we have been seeing a shockingly low amount of acorn starch grains in milling stones and bedrock mortars. And so that brings into question the preservation aspect of acorn or the previously thought and widely viewed concept that bedrock mortars were only used for acorn processing. So it's something that colleagues and I have been kind of discussing, like, do we need a larger sample size to test this? Because I mean, we did some work out at Malakoff Diggins State Park and actually worked on a collaborative interpretive panel. And so I was able to do the starch grain for that. And We sampled, I think, 6 BRMs and we found 0 starch grains for acorn. So brings a lot of things into question, and we're kind of trying to figure out if that's something we can research more and present on in the future. Okay. Back to the environmental setting, talking about the ranch that you asked about earlier. The ranch is a privately owned and operated. It's kind of the summer house of a very wealthy man. He even has his own airstrip, and his family fly out there to go hunting every year. This landscape contains many habitats. For example, in the picture shown, the Ridgeline Valley or grassland. Picture B shows denser oak woodlands or foothill woodlands. And picture C is the example of a natural spring that's out there. And you can always find like watercress and, you know, some native lettuce over there.
Can you say, if that's by the Sutter Buttes?
It's near, like you can see the buttes from the property. It's more so, if you're familiar, it's closer to like Marysville. It's, if you are ever in like the Chico area and you drive to Tahoe, you kind of take that back road over. It's kind of more in that range. Yeah. And like, as you all know, like each of those habitats provide a rich diversity of food material. The landscape had been intensely surveyed by archaeologists from Sonoma State's Anthropological Study Center between 2013 and 2018. A substantial amount of prehistoric and historic resources were identified across the ranch. In particular, there's 1,396 BRMs, so individual mortars on the boulders. A few academic publications have been produced about the ranch, including 2 prior master's theses with Price 2016 and Fraterelli 2021. My research is based on Price's 2016 urge for future scholars to conduct starch grain residue analysis on BRMs at the ranch. While Fraterelli 2021 analyzed one of the sites in my thesis with other non-destructive archaeological methods, such as GPR and LIDAR. So ground penetrating radar, and I do not remember what LIDAR stands for, fancy. So,
Laser.
right? I always forget one of the letters. Oh, okay. Here we go. So the ranch is the ancestral home of the Nisenan Maidu people. The Nisenan hunted and gathered as a community and were known to have familial ownership over oak tree groves within their community. This photo here is of Lizzie Enos, a Nisenan informant. We use the word informant because it was kind of prior to oral histories. So back then it was called ethnology. There's, depending on the time, could have been an ethnology or another word, but they were getting traded items to talk about their people, right? And the information I could find about her were like in unpublished documents. I just happened to, at the time of writing this, as I was telling you earlier, worked many jobs. And so one of the places I was working at, Pacific Legacy, which is out outskirts of Sacramento, so in El Dorado Hills, they had a woman that just collected a lot of information. So she had a lot of information about the Nisenan, a lot of unpublished Nisenan uses of plants, some master's thesis from Sacramento that people never finished. And so I went and I read through all of her things in her library, and I was able to find this really interesting write-up, like it was handwritten still, like in cursive, from like the late 1800s, so like 1890s, and like some journal stuff. So I was able to find some really cool information about this lemon and some of the plants that they used. I digress.
Fascinating.
I do. But the present day Nisenan people live within a few counties, and some of them are a part of the Nevada City Rancheria. And so I was actually lucky enough to have some representatives join me in my field days out on the ranch while I was collecting samples. You'll see some pictures of them later on in this presentation. Okay. So ancient starch research is a three-pronged framework. So in picture one, you can see the field extraction methods that include sonication for 10 minutes with distilled water. Picture two is the lab processing using heavy liquid flotation technique that includes 20-minute centrifuge intervals. And lastly, in picture three, microscopic analysis and identification. So starch grains were photographed and ID'd against the reference collection that I created myself. Also, some of that archival research I mentioned earlier, which was at the Dottie Ethnographic Library, housed at Pacific Legacy. I'm glad I got that right because I did that off the cuff. And lastly, ethnobotanical research informed the creation of my starch grain comparative collection and aided in the interpreting of the habitation sites for function. Okay. So going a little bit more in depth about the sites that I looked at, because earlier in the presentation, you saw that big giant map and you're like, that's a lot of dots. So that all of those were plotted based on the amount of sites that were found on the ranch. But for this research, I only looked at 2 of the sites. So the first one, the first habitation site, was what I called the open air site. So it was more so like in the valley. It was like pretty much grassland. There were some oaks. But that site dated to 1100 to 1800 years before present. It was a multi-component site nestled in the foothill valleys. And this site contained 6 BRMs on 3 different rock outcrops. And other features included 3 rock cairns, a rock alignment, and 14 stone tools. So there is a little bit of a discussion about what a rock cairn could signify. And out here on the ranch, we are interpreting those to be sort of like a headstone for burials. And if I remember correctly, they did cremain burials out here. And I had mentioned at dinner like, I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with the canine troops that, you know, search for cremated individuals. That was another research avenue that was undertaken out here at the ranch. Let's see. So 2 other outlying sites I also included within this open air site, and those included 3 other BRMs. So the second site I looked at is what I called the rock shelter site. And that was located about 1 mile south from the open air site, but up on the ridge line. So vegetation was different. You know, there's a lot more rocks. There is definitely more trees. But what was interesting is that this site dated to 1290 to 1470 years before present. And this site contained 2 rock shelters and 27 BRMs sprawled around the entire outcrop region. So there was 2 rock shelters in the middle, and around the entire thing, there was BRMs. But also there were 12 other stone tools. There were cooking rocks, milling stones, a pestle that was found, and also petroglyphs. Okay, So talking a lot about all the background, right? A lot of things to talk about, but you know, what we're really here for and what this chapter helped me out with in the past was funding to talk about the plants, right? So from the 16 BRMs that I sampled, between the two sites, 73 starch grains were present, including 13 different taxa identified to genus, 1 type, some unidentifiable grass seeds, an unidentifiable Brodii USO, so an underground storage organ. And so Brodii are an herbaceous plant family that grows from corms. They're pretty diagnostic when you look at their starch grains, but sometimes they're also similar. The difference can be within like a micron, so it's easier to go ahead and say that they're an unidentifiable Brodii USO. So a few examples of taxa identified from a specific cup. So one mortar within the rock shelter site was pine, yampa, and a BRM, so one of those cups from the open air site contained rye and cattail. So all 4 starch grains have the same scale on here, but as you can tell, even without having to do, you know, background research and teach yourself how to do this, you can tell that those all kind of look different, right? A little bit. It's dark in here. You think you can see them? Some are brighter than others. Some look kind of stretched out and elongated. Okay. So for example, the pine is more of a spherical shape, while the rye is one of those a little bit more elongated ellipsoids with an elongated extension cross. So in the very center, instead of it looking like a T or an X, it kind of looks like 2 Ys. That's the best way that I can describe it. Okay, so this slide depicts all of the results from the BRMs at the open air site. 5 BRMs resulted in the presence of starch grains, and all 3 cups from context 3215, 3221, and 3224. While the remaining 3 contain no starch grains present. 5 taxa were identified to the nearest genus, with rye being the most common taxa identified. Additionally, red maize, barley, yampa, and cattail. There were 3 categories of starch grains identified to resource type. So the unidentifiable bunch grass, small seeds, and also Brodii USOs. Context 3215.02 contains the largest variety of taxa. And moving forward in this discussion, I will be focusing on the context 3224.01 outlined here in green. This slide shows the graph from the rock shelter site. And at this site, 7 out of the 8 BRMs resulted in the presence of starch grain residue. 10 taxa were identified to the nearest genus, with rush being the most common. Additionally, lily, oat, blue dix, yampa, pine, cherry, rice, oak, and cattail. For the remainder of the discussion about the rock shelter site, I will focus on the cup 360106, outlined here in green. Okay. Utilizing the life histories of all the plants identified, I investigated the possibility of the seasonal use of each site. The starch grains identified from the open air site were dominated by grasses and herbaceous plants. The data indicates that the dominant harvest season and thus inferred site occupation is during the spring to summer. See the taxa highlighted here in green. significantly, there's no oak. The plant-based resources from the rock shelter site were dominated by rush and a smaller amount of other plants like grasses, nuts, a berry, and a USO. These can all be harvested from late spring to fall, with the majority of the taxa available for harvest during the summer months. You can see some of those outlined in yellow. Overall, the combination of taxa recovered from this site suggests a multi-seasonal occupation extending from the late spring to fall, with possibly 2 discrete occupations in the late spring and or from late spring to summer and or summer to fall. Okay. I used the results from context 322401 to infer the function of the BRM. These taxa identified include cattail, which can be used to make doors or mats and coverings for summer shelters. You can see this tiny picture at the top. Rye seeds were ground into flour using BRMs and could also be used to make medicine for your eyes. And lastly, yampa was used for medicine and food. And all 3 taxa can be harvested from May to June. So possible site function based on ethnobotany and the artifacts, the open air site could represent a seasonal hunting base camp where food and materials were processed. A taskscape represents the hypothetical habitual daily activities and the locations the Nisenan traveled to in order to conduct those tasks, such that a family group could sustain and maintain their lifestyles. This schematic design was created to illustrate a BRM taskscape at the open air site. I used the results from the context 322401 to create a schematic design to portray the concept of a taskscape based on the taxa identified within that one BRM. The data retrieved from this BRM identified different habitats visited via hypothetical family use routes to harvest locations across the landscape. I'm like, I should have brought a laser pointer. I don't have one. I used to have a dog that I used to like them, but I don't anymore. So if you can see, oh, wonder if I can do it with my cursor. Oh, that works. That works. So here's that one BRM. And what I'm trying to, convince other people of is that this is one possible route that a family could go to reach a grassland to gather that rye or that yampa. And then they would go along this seasonal creek to a water source and gather up some cattail. Maybe a third group, or maybe the same group, could travel this way into the woodlands and gather up yampa or rye. Okay. So the possible site function based on the ethnobotany with the rock shelter site could represent a seasonal base camp where medicine, food, and materials were processed. This schematic design was, that's not right. Just kidding. I was like, I don't get to tell you my favorite part. Oh, okay, let's see. We're back here at the rock shelter site. So I think overall, this was the most exciting cup that I got to, investigate. One of my very closest friends, Sydney Kitchell, is also an archaeologist, but also an herbalist and ethnobotanist. And she runs her own company out of an herbalist company out of Sebastopol. And when I was looking up what these 3 items could be used for, I was shocked. I was excited. I was so proud. I was like, it actually makes sense. This could be real. All 3 of the all three of the taxas identified all had like uses for cold medicine, you know? And I'm like, what? I was like screaming. I instantly called her. I was like, I'll show you something so cool. It's really great to do research and then it actually kind of makes sense, you know? Because sometimes you do it and you're like, no one is ever going to understand this. But when you think about one thing, everyone has to use cold medicine, right? Everyone does. And so I thought it was amazing. And right. And I kind of tried to look into some things and I was like, oh, look, you know, there is still cherry bark tea out there. You know, that's still a thing. I digress. Let's get back on track so you guys can ask me questions. Okay. Okay, so let's see.
Interesting digression.
I know, that's the best part. So pine nuts can be eaten, right? Most of us eat pesto. Pine nuts are one of the ingredients in pesto, but the pitch of the pine can be used for medicine. And so that's that aspect that's going to be in that cold medicine. And cherry fruit is eaten, could be juiced or not, but the bark is the aspect that is used for your medicine. Typically in teas or a decoction, we want to go down that route. But as I was saying, cherry bark tea is still a popular today for a cold remedy. I bet we can probably find some in Oliver's. The root of the yampa could be eaten. It's a it's a good staple because it can be stored for a long period of time. But the yampa seeds were the part that was used in medicine. And all three taxas could be harvested in September. You know, that part of that time of the year where like the beginning of the people start to get sick. So cool. Let's talk about, now I want to talk about usnea. That's my new favorite cold medicine thing. Okay. So the possible site function based on the ethnobotany, as I was describing at the rock shelter site, that could have been a base camp where medicine, food, and or other materials were processed. And one thing I kind of thought about, you know, that like later in the year, maybe you don't want to be in the valleys and maybe you really do want to be higher up in elevation. But also that's when you're kind of gonna want to be inside of those rock shelters, right? They're a little bit cooler when you are in like the Sacramento Valley region, you know how hot it gets later in the season. So that's another thing to kind of think about. But this schematic design was created to illustrate the BRM Taskscape at the rock shelter. And so the data retrieved from the BRMs identified different habitats that could have been used and traveled to along hypothetical family use routes that I mentioned before. So by identifying the habitats of importance for familial resource procurement zones, I have identified significant places on the landscape that enrich the social landscape of the ranch. So as I have expressed, a lot of time, thought, and ancestral knowledge goes into the working of a taskscape. This social connectivity cannot be witnessed through a simple schematic design, but is vastly important in a taskscape and what makes a taskscape a criteria for a social landscape. So a micro-scale social landscape represents the Nisenaans' occupation and movement from their seasonal camps to different gathering zones. The two sites evaluated in this research were likely utilized over a couple hundred years, and there is a chance that the same harvesting zones were visited via family use routes by successive generations. If those habitats, so the wetlands, the grasslands, the foothill woodlands, were visited and used by the same familial generational groups, they were imbued with social and familial meaning and can thus be considered significant. I argued that these habitats are culturally significant natural resources and should be protected like other cultural resources. These important resources procurement areas should be preserved and avoided during new construction or through the mitigation process, which avoidance cannot be obtained when near a prehistoric habitation site. So in conclusion, after analyzing 16 BRMs at the ranch, I was successful in recovering 76 starch grains from 13 different taxa. I believe I had proven that starch grain analysis can be used for more than just identification of the plant-based resources in the past. It can also be used to enrich a discussion of a social landscape, as seen here with the creations of those schemata designs used to visualize that BRM taskscape at the ranch. So why does this matter? This research has identified different habitats that were utilized by the Nisenan in the past. I believe that these habitats are considered and should be considered culturally significant natural resources. Overall, starch grain residue analysis provides critical data regarding prior plant utilization, which may not be readily achieved through traditional macrobotanical analysis. It can be successful in aiding in identification of the seasonality of site use and inferred habitats utilized in a taskscape. The two BRMs and their corresponding starch grain data used to influence the schematic designs have proven beneficial to demonstrate the concept of a taskscape and describe how a subsistence settlement system contributes to a social landscape. This new approach of taskscape reconstruction can be added to the archaeologist, wow, I don't say that word that much anymore, toolkit for interpreting Native Californians' social landscapes through their subsistence settlement systems. Many of the research questions were answers as I chipped away at the bigger goal of this project by investigating 2 habitation sites at the ranch. Future scholars can expand on this work and integrate other analysis to make more achievements towards understanding how the Nisenan engaged in their environment by creating and maintaining their social landscape. So future scholars could expand on the research by testing other BRMs with starch grain residue analysis at the habitation sites within the ranch. Larger habitation sites could be tested to see what their seasonality of use was like. Phytolith analysis can be done on the same 16 samples used in this work by the piggyback method. If you have questions about that, I can tell you. I still have the samples.
I don't know what a
A phytolith, so my chair did phytolith research, which is why I was paired up with her. She also did pollen. So phytolith is more like the it's like within the leafy part of a plant, there's a specific structure in there that can be traced back to each type of taxa. And so I don't know how people do that. It looks way harder than starch grains. But I can show you what pictures of it look like. They are microscopic, and they're just floated at a different density than starch grains. So starch grains have to get floated at a density, like a water density, if I can remember, like 2.6. In comparison to a phytolith, it's at a different density. So when they're spun, you can spin first for starch. You can add more of your SPT, so sodium polytungstate, and then you can spin it again, and then you'll get your phytoliths out of that. So that's the piggyback method. Yeah. But pollen's really cool. Pollen's kind of how I got into wanting to go down the route of archaeobotany. Yeah. So that's a good story we can talk about later.
It's still like a base.
I think so. The only thing that was coming to my mind, Virginia, was semi-crystalline structures, which is starch. Yeah. So yeah, let's see, what else we got?
So you have your samples preserved.
I do, yeah,
How are they preserved?
in the fridge. I keep them in the same, centrifuge tubes, just to decrease any, because without that density, it floats to the bottom. So like if anyone else wanted to use it, I leave it in the exact same container that I put it in after I floated it. Just in case, right? Because it could all get stuck to the bottom, sort of a thing. Yeah, I don't really have much else to say after that.
How does I don't quite understand how this residue survives
Mhm,
over the centuries. On the stone,
mhm,
but not in the stone,
correct.
and yet it's still there after sun, water, wind, etc.
Yeah, so, like one of those articles I spoke about before, where they were the first to test different archaeological artifacts that were found on survey, which means they were not covered in any soil to keep them protected. So they did they did go through all the different weathering processes. And so there's a few different ways to extract your samples. So one of the authors had talked about on your first sonification, you are just trying to get that looser soil or looser material off first. And then you go in with more distilled water and you're trying to get out any of the residues that's stuck in the cracks, because the majority of the time, the boulders that were used were not like completely smooth type of rock. So there's like a lot of cracks and crevices in there that you're really trying to like work at to extract any sort of residue you can.
Can you explain the sonification part a little more?
Oh yeah, so basically it's like a sonic hair toothbrush, and you have to use one toothbrush head per bowl, right? So there's no cross contamination. Like I don't want to put my toothbrush in your mouth, you know? And so what you do is you have like a whole kit. So I have like a travel kit. It has my gloves, my toothbrush, just the base, and then individually wrapped toothbrush heads. And also like individually wrapped pipettes. So you're pipetting with the same pipette into the same bowl or cup or into the same centrifuge tube. So the way that I do it is I pipette straight from the bowl into the tube, and that's the one that I end up spinning later. Because like you use a lot of water, because sometimes the cup drinks up the water, right? It's very strange. I know you're like, how is this stone drinking all of my water? But sometimes I've had to use like 5 or 6 15 milliliter cup, like centrifuge tubes, to get out one tube, sort of a thing. Like it just soaks it right up. And so you sit there and you sonicate for 25-minute intervals 4 times. Yeah, sonicate, like really try to get, like the best way I try to describe it to my kids is like get every aspect of your tooth, right? Like the front, the back, the top, the bottom, every single part. And then you pipette it out. And then you do lab work. I'm gonna get you in the back there.
What does BRM stand for?
Bedrock milling feature. So there's been some controversy about what it stands for. Because the way that I talk about it, there's a bedrock milling station, which is the whole rock I'm gonna skip this, picture of my cohort really quick. Close your eyes. I'm gonna click back really fast. All right, let's see. So, like, I would call this whole thing here, I would call that a bedrock milling station, which means it has multiple BRMs, so the individual mortar, bedrock mortar. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
One other question.
Yeah.
On the theoretical routes that you show between the sites,
Uh-huh.
are there any possible names of those paths, as it were, on the earth?
So, one, not really at this site. That's something that you would probably be able to look at, with LiDAR. But on this ranch, there is, cattle out there. So, and there was ranching as well, like we can trace back, previous inhabitants of the ranch. Like for example, I think the Duckett family lived out there in the 1800s. And so someone I know did, their thesis on that family. And, you know, got them all back together out at the ranch and showed them all the artifacts from their old homestead. Yeah. Did you still have a question? Or did it get answered? Or didn't it?
Oh, I wanted to know what the theology was in terms of the rock outflow. The majority, was it salt?
Basalt is more black. No, it was, more of a metamorphic rock. So like more than one color.
Yes.
I'm really not great at
So there's a bedrock border,
Uh-huh.
a single one, at a site in Tiburon, where I'd done some research years ago, and it's a stuff called Walk of Fame schist,
Mm,
and it's this blue mineral. And it's a really pretty rock, but I often.
kind of glittery.
Yeah, yeah, it's got micaceous
Yeah.
qualities to it, but I'm always curious about whether or not the mineral components to make up the rock would get it in, end up in archaeological evidence.
Yeah, so what I know about schist is that was used in more ceremonial purposes, and schist was actually ground up and used.
Yeah.
But when it comes to like any of the rock that was kind of ground down, if any of that was getting into your food, I would say probably not. Because there are, you know, there is evidence of like soap root brushes, you know, and so you're like the best way that I think about it is like if you were gonna make guacamole in your modern mortar and pestle, you would probably clean it up first. Yeah. Or like, yeah, like I use my mortar and pestle at home to grind up fennel seeds because we use it in our biscuits and gravy. And we always make sure it's all cleared out and no other herb made it in before we put it in biscuits and gravy. And you had a question?
The same tribe that Ishi, the guy from long ago, the last
The,
last Indians there by Chico.
Yeah, Yana and Ish, yeah, Ishi was Yana. We was Yahi, or
Yeah.
Yahi.
yeah, not quite. So the Nisenan are a subgroup of the Maidu. So within the whole branch of the Maidu, there's 3 different groups. So you had, I think I ended up taking the map out of my presentation, but there's the Nisenan, which are kind of like if we're looking at the Sacramento Valley, you have like your Nisenans over here, and then you have the Concow, which could be called like the Hill Maidu, and then you have the Maidu that stayed more so in the valley and didn't creep up anywhere into the didn't creep up anywhere. You know, they traveled a lot, but they weren't steadily, they didn't long-term stay in the mountains. Did that help? kind of.
They probably bumped into one another
Mhm.
back in the day.
A lot of overlap, a lot of overlapping territories.
Would be further north, right?
Let's see.
Because they found him in Oroville, so I'm assuming that that's north of where you're talking about.
Orville. So,
But he came down.
yeah, so Orville would actually be like in Concal territory.
Oh.
Like Orville to Susanville, like over there, if you're familiar. I mean, I know you're familiar. So yeah, that would be Concal. And or there's all these subgroups like the Machupta. So like when I went to Chico State, I lived in the Machupta dorm. That's named after one of the Maidu subgroups. Yeah. Uh-huh.
With the starch grains, you mentioned that they can come from all different parts of the plant.
Mhm.
Are you able to identify what part of the plant was being used when analyzing them? Or does?
So I can't. But there has been research done, trying to figure that out. So there was some research done, in Africa, trying to figure out which part of grass was used, because there was like ethnobotanical information that this specific type of grass wasn't eaten. It was only used for fiber craft. So where you would like beat up the stalks to extract the fibers to make string or to make netting, things like that. And so they tried to investigate that same sort of question. Because there wasn't actually any, like what they found out is that the starch grains that they found were not from the seeds, which was the edible part, and was found from the fleshy part of the plant. So that's the only instance that I was able to find, at least when I was doing this a couple years back, about trying to figure out the difference between which part of the plant the starch was coming from. And what I talked about with one of my one of the individuals on my committee who taught me how to do this. Like he thought that like what he tried to argue in some of his later work after his master's thesis was that it wasn't about how the starch grain looked different in each part of the plant. You just might have a different quantity that survives afterwards. So like, for example, if we looked at something that had a corm in it, then that corm would have higher starch content because that's where the majority of its life is coming from, right? It's not a fruit on that, or it's not going to be the seed from that flower that comes out of the corm. So hypothetical.
It's good that same hypothetical thing applying to, in the ethnographic record, there's a lot of commentary about, people using cattail rhizomes as food, and creating flour and
Mm-hmm.
like potatoes. So would there be a way to tell the difference?
So
Between the residue from the rhizome versus stems or pollen?
yeah, I think that's like a really good thing that could be like someone's individual research for like a specific plant, right? And see if they can tell a difference. Is the difference in size, like by micron? Is the difference in quantity? Things like that. Or is the difference something about like how the overall look of the grain is? I didn't really get into it, but you can also kind of tell, if the grain was boiled or if it was roasted, or it affects the grain in different ways. And so that would be pretty cool.
It would.
Yeah.
Because I've read so many comments about it, and I did a project once when I was at Cal on
Mhm.
collecting cattail rhizomes and
Yeah.
preparing. But it was very basic kind of research, and I've always been curious about this.
Mhm.
You mentioned cattail.
Yeah.
This is fascinating.
So you mentioned the age of the sites when they were being used and stuff. Is that from your data was able to age it, or was there some other,
That was not from my data. There has been some research projects on trying to figure out if you can date starch grains. Or not. There's been some successful ones, there has been some non-successful ones. It really depends on how much you have preserved. But these sites were dated, in a different manner. So with obsidian or with, no, I don't think there was any faunal remains in the two sites. So it had to have been done with obsidian. Yeah.